Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Big Tent USA. My name is Melissa Kane, and I am the vice chair of Big Tent USA. And I am so thrilled to be welcoming our friends Marc Elias, Joyce Vance, and Galen back into the tent for the second in a series of spotlight events focused on what's at stake and what we must do to safeguard the 2026 midterm elections in the face of the threats that we are already seeing from MAGA aligned forces and Donald Trump. Big Tent USA is steadfast in our commitment to defending our democratic values, our Constitution, and the rule of law. Our goal is to empower our community with facts and calls to action so we can all become stronger, more effective advocates for our country. There are always calls to action on our website, and we'll add a link in the chat. But here are a couple that we're calling out this week. You can oppose Mark Wayne Mullins' confirmation for DHS secretary with 5 calls, and you can organize against ICE detention centers coming to your neighborhood with a map and ways to push back from Courier Newsroom. So again, links are going to be in the chat with everything you need to know to make your voice heard. Okay, let's get started. Marc Elias, in addition to successfully arguing 4 cases in the US Supreme Court and leading the historic winning legal effort, hi Mark, to protect voting rights in 2020, is the founder of Democracy Docket, the leading platform for advocacy and information about voting rights, elections, redistricting, and democracy. Joyce White Vance is a former U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama, a distinguished professor of law at the University of Alabama, a legal analyst for NBC and MS Now, and the author of the Civil Discourse newsletter. She also co-hosts the podcast Sisters in Law and Insider. And Galen is an independent political strategist, co-founder of the Lincoln Project, and currently serves as the president of the Union, a nationwide coalition working to rebuild American democracy from the ground up. Hi, Reed. Hi, Mark. Hi, Joyce. Thank you so much for being with us. As the words out of Trump's mouth and the Save America Act and what went down in Dallas County Week continue to show, there are a lot of warning signs that we need to be heeding and much that we need to know about how we can fight this serious election tampering for the midterms that's already started. So we're really, really glad that you're here. So please take it away. And again, thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you, Melissa, and thanks to everybody for joining us, and thanks to Big Tent for hosting this, and thanks to Mark and Joyce for joining us, guys. If there are 2 people who are in on the fight on the front lines every day, it is Mark and Joyce, so I'm so happy they have joined us today. Okay, I'm going to actually get started with a question that Joyce asked Mark before we got started. So, Mark, what is going on in Maricopa County, Arizona? What is happening out west?
Yeah, so first of all, I want to also thank Big Tent for doing this event. And Reed, thank you for hosting. And Joyce, always you're one of my favorite people to be on her podcast. If you're not subscribed to her newsletter, you absolutely need to. And her podcast is fabulous also. So look, what's going on in Maricopa County is a variant of what we saw in Fulton County, right? In Fulton County, we saw the raiding of the election facility and the seizing of the ballots from 2020. In Fulton County, essentially there was a right-wing audit after 2020. It was not like a legitimate audit, but it was an audit nevertheless. That was turned over to the Republican Senate. And there has been a grand jury subpoena issued, federal grand jury subpoena, for the records that the Senate has. And in both instances, I think we can say 2 things are happening, and they are both independently significant. The first is the continuation of the big lie, an effort to cast doubt on the outcome of the 2020 election that we know is going on. But the second thing is, I think is as important or more important and independently significant, which is a dry run for 2026, because as Joyce will tell you, when she was the U.S. attorney, there was no handbook on how you seize ballots. It's not something that we do in a democracy. It's not something that the Department of Justice is trained for or the FBI is trained for. So if they want to be prepared to do it in 2026 come November, then they need some practice, and they need to figure out, like, what's the right language? What are the right records to seek? How do you do this logistically? And I think that the Fulton and Maricopa County are serving that purpose as well. Because I think that Pam Bondi does whatever Donald Trump wants, and She doesn't know that Donald Trump won't ask her to do this. Remember, there was an executive order, a draft executive order after the 2020 election that he considered. He didn't sign it, and part of why he didn't sign it is because the Department of Justice higher echelon in Trump 1 were refusing to do it. And I don't think Pam Bondi would refuse to do it.
So Joyce, I want to go back to something that Mark mentioned, which was Fulton County. And we don't use this kind of expression very often, but give us a sense from your perspective as a former U.S. attorney and a law professor as well, the idea of the head of the security services being at a facility like that with federal agents.
Yeah, I mean, it was utterly shocking, right? When we saw Tulsi Gabbard, someone who works in national intelligence, not domestic law enforcement, show up at that scene. If you needed sort of a red flag that something here wasn't right, that was it. You know, Mark makes the most important point here, which is that federal prosecutors and federal agents need practice if they're going to try to do some crazy monkey business after the next election, because there's no roadmap for doing it. In fact, federal prosecutors understand that explicitly they don't get involved in deciding the outcome of elections. And that's been the rule, Republican or Democratic administration, the entire 25 years that I spent inside of the Justice Department. So this is a sea change and not a very attractive one. And the whole idea that somehow we're going to invoke national security concerns to justify what's going on, because at least to me, that's what Tulsi Gabbard's presence signifies, that they're trying to figure out how are we going to get away with doing something that's so unprecedented that it's likely to provoke an uproar on both sides of the aisle, at least to some extent. And the answer is national security. And you know, we've seen Trump do this repeatedly. He manufactures a crisis, manufactures an emergency, finds a statute that gives him extraordinary powers in the face of that emergency, and then proceeds to drive a Mack truck through what's left of American democracy. I think that's what her presence there signifies.
So Mark, let's talk a little bit about this. You know, there have been discussions as we're having tonight about what's going to happen in 2026. Give us from your perspective, because elections by the Constitution are run by the states, how do you see, to Joyce's point, you know, the federal government, the Trump administration trying to interfere with the specific operations of elections were run by county registrars or secretaries of state, whatever it might be?
Yeah, look, I think they're going to have two plans or two roles, right? One is in places where they are not welcomed. And that's really what most of our discussion's been about, is we are assuming that the states will jealously guard their prerogatives. Well, Reed, we also assume that Congress would jealously guard its prerogatives against the executive branch. And I think, you know, we need to come back to this because we need to talk not just about what's going to happen in states where Democrats run the show, but what's going to happen in Alabama, right? What's going to happen in Texas? What's going to happen in Florida, where those governors may say, "Come on in," you know, right. So I want to come back to that, but I think the thrust of your question is: let's assume for a moment that that Donald Trump decides to deploy the federal government in ways that are contrary to what the states want, because as you say, the Constitution gives states the power to set the time, place, and manner of elections. It gives Congress, through legislation, the ability to override those choices. But Congress is not passing legislation, right? Like we're not talking about, you know, both houses of Congress passing bills signed by the president. And as a federal court said in Washington, D.C. recently, in a case that I was involved in litigating, the president has no role in this, right? The Constitution gives presidents no role. So what you're going to see is that when Congress, for example, does not pass the SAVE Act, which it's not going to, the president is going to issue an executive order claiming power he does not have. He will get sued and he will lose. Then, as Joyce says, he will revert to what he believes to be residual power in the Constitution, or which he doesn't have, or one of these emergency statutes. I don't think it's a surprise that Tulsi Gabbard was there. I also don't think it's a surprise that when he announced the attack in Iran, the very next social media post after that was him saying that Iran was involved in election interference, right? Like you can see him trying to elevate up national security, a place that usually presidents get a lot of deference. And I think you're going to see him try to assert that he can take power away from Congress, away from the states, and unilaterally dictate the rules of elections. When that fails, he will try to deploy the Department of Justice and the paramilitary forces of the federal government. And look, Reed, we've seen this playbook before. It ends with violence.
Yeah,
Right. It
right.
ends like Donald Trump escalates through rhetoric to powers, to the courts, to other powers, to the courts. But at the end of the day, like we saw people shot in the streets of Minneapolis. We saw January 6th, right? He will escalate this as far as he needs to go.
And Joyce, that I wanted to bring up Minneapolis, and I'm glad Mark referenced it, because in the wake of that, my sense was, and I'd love to get both of your opinions on this, was that they were pushing and pushing and pushing ICE in Minneapolis, a place where I believe, having talked to Congresswoman Angie Craig, Minnesota is 24 on the list of states that have undocumented immigrants, right? So this was middle of the road for folks coming into the country. They shoot Renee Good. And then, violence on the part of the federal officers takes place, but the people didn't give them what the administration wanted. I think they wanted more burning police stations.
Yes.
It was going to give them the reason to go further and further and further, but the people didn't do that. So give us a sense from your perspective about how, as Mark is talking about this, if violence is on the table, how is it that individual citizens in these places can now start planning for this for us now? How do we do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a direct through line from the teachings of Dr. King about the importance of peaceful protest to what we saw in Minneapolis and to a lesser extent in Maine, where ICE went in. The tie-in there is that both of those states have large immigrant Somali communities. And that seemed to be something of a focus there. So the reality is, as American citizens, we're going to have to be exceptionally disciplined. And we know we can do it because we saw what happened in Minnesota, and we saw how just exemplary those protests were in every way. It is not going to be easy. I think that this is an administration that will try to throw bait and get people to take it, like they did with this utterly ludicrous prosecution of Don Lemon. And look, I think something that we have to be concerned about is some sort of an event that's triggered or even something that's planted. And so that means that every day as we go out to protest, and I know a lot of groups do this, Indivisible does a great job with this, as do others. They do training in advance about the importance of peaceful, nonviolent protest. It reminds me of what I've heard from foot soldiers in the Deep South about how they operated under SNCC and other groups when they were protesting for voting rights. But that's the path forward. I don't think that we can say that enough, how critical it's going to be to not give them any excuse to accelerate, because they're looking for it and they're trying to manufacture it.
It's interesting you bring up Alabama. I just saw a picture, Joyce, of that incredible image of John Lewis and his friends with the. I mean, these guys could not have been out of central casting more, with their hard hats on and their guns and their clubs, and the guy pointing it was indelible, to say the least.
I mean, can I just say this weekend was the 61st anniversary of the Selma Bridge crossing, where John Lewis was beaten so badly that he suffered a concussion. So many of the foot soldiers we've lost, they're sort of getting older and passing on. And the ones that are left do talk about how determined they were to remain peaceful and strong in the face of what they were suffering at the hands of state troopers. And I hope that they'll be an inspiration to all of us, and people will go back and look at those pictures and at that history.
Well, and now we have the names of Renee Good and Alex Preddy to add to that long line of people. I mean, Renee Good literally just trying to go home, right? Just trying to go home. So Mark, tell us a little bit more about how else you think, from a legal perspective, the Trump administration and Republicans in Congress, and as you should say, local Republicans, are going to try and do this. I know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in Texas, which I think has 258 counties, it's a gigantic state with a lot of counties. Harris County, Houston has, I think, one voter drop box now for a county of 4 or 5 million people. What are some of those other tactics that they're going to do to create enough friction that people say it's just not worth it?
Yeah. So first of all, I think it's important to echo something that the two of you said. Renee Good, she was shot with stuffed animals in her glove compartment and the family dog in the back seat. She was not looking, she was, as you say, looking to go home. Alex Preddy was trying to prevent another woman from being essentially assaulted and was thrown to the ground and assaulted and ultimately shot. And, the tragedy of that, I think I'm glad you guys mentioned it in a conversation about voting and democracy, because we can't lose sight of just how brutal the Trump administration is willing to be when people stand up peacefully against them. In terms of what to expect Republicans to do this fall, I'm glad you used the word friction, Reed, because I get a lot of questions, and there's no question, and I bet you were going to get it tonight. Like, what about, armed ICE agents at the polls? And I always say, like, before we worry about armed ICE agents at the polls, let's talk about traffic, right? Because, like, honestly, Reed, if you were able to go to your local polling place and the only thing you had to confront was an armed ICE agent at the polls, you'd go vote, right? Like it wouldn't dissuade you. But what if ICE closes the roads? What if they, take up all the parking spots? What if they create a commotion out and that makes people feel like there will be chaos and difficulty getting to vote? And that's why I love the word you use, friction. I'm going to steal that going forward. Like, friction is the best voter suppression device that Republicans have. It is the incremental things that they do to make it marginally more inconvenient. And at each stage of it becoming more inconvenient, more people just decide they don't have the time, they don't have childcare, they can't take off time from work, and they're not going to go vote. And so, yeah, what we saw, when you talk about reducing the number of drop boxes, that is just creating friction. When you talk about cutting the number of days of early voting, that is friction. When we talk about the SAVE Act and the proof of citizenship requirements that require people, in order to register to vote, to have either their original birth certificate or their passport, those are friction points. And when we say that married women will have to be able to prove a connection between the name on their birth certificate and the name on their driver's license, and they'll have to be able to prove through certified documents, notarized documents, a chain of connection points, that is friction. It's not to say that those things are impossible, but at each stage there, you are making it harder and harder and harder. And at each stage, some number of people drop off the process. I was on I did an event earlier today where someone said, well, but we haven't seen this before. I said, that's not true. In 2024, we saw bomb threats called in to large numbers of Democratic-based precincts with large number of Black voters. That's a huge friction point, right? They close the polls. People are told they can't vote. They have to stand around and wait for the polls to be cleared out. Well, like, look, I sometimes say this in rooms full of more affluent people. How long would you wait around outside for that to be cleared up before you'd leave? Now imagine you've got children where you're paying a babysitter, or you don't have a babysitter, or you've got to go to work. So I think there are a lot of low-level things that that are underappreciated and undercovered by the legacy media before we get to the catastrophic things that they can do. And so I'm really glad that you use that word.
Yeah, and Joyce, let me ask you this. I mean, the one thing that I think if we get, it's easy to get stuck inside our bubbles, right? Our thought bubbles, our conversation bubbles, all these. But what Mark just mentioned about the SAVE Act and the idea of having your voter registration card as a married woman match your birth certificate. I think a lot of times, because we see Donald Trump at the podium and he's incoherent, that we underestimate just how well-resourced and relentless the people are that we're up against, and the fact that they are, in fact, very intelligent, even if they're using that power for evil instead of for good.
Yeah, voter suppression, nothing new. Donald Trump did not start it, right? The myth of voter fraud being used to enact laws and practices that in effect suppress Democratic votes, that's also old school stuff for anybody who's been doing voting rights work in Alabama for as long as I've been doing it. And I think that the point that you and Mark are making about friction is absolutely the right one to make. Combining polling places so that suddenly voters in blue box areas are waiting in line for 4 hours to vote. That's not just something that we make up and talk about. That actually happened where I vote during the last presidential election. I was there first thing in the morning. I waited 2.5 hours. My husband in mid-afternoon waited 4 hours to vote. And that's just the sort of crazy sauce that I think we're going to have to prepare for from these people, because they are voter suppression warriors. They know what makes it the most difficult for people to vote. I think that it's getting ramped up. And this new sort of story to support the idea of voter fraud based on the idea that people who aren't citizens are voting, which is really crazy, right? Because everybody who successfully flees El Salvador and violence and comes to this country, the first thing that they're going to want to do, right, is turn around and go and vote illegally.
Right,
So that
commit a
they
felony.
get caught
Right.
and deported when their vote's going to have no impact on the
Right.
outcome of the election. Sure, that makes a lot of sense. But that's the nonsense that Trump is selling to his base. And that, I think, will give some oomph. I hope that Mark is right. I think Mark is right that the SAVE Act won't pass in the Senate. That doesn't necessarily mean that some states won't try to adopt measures like that or akin to that. And of course, we all know that they line up to do this. They're really good at doing this. And I'll just share one sort of example of what we need to be prepared for. In 2011, Mark's going to correct me if I have that year wrong, because I'm horrible with years now. I am waiting in Alabama for the Attorney General to submit for pre-clearance the state's brand new Identification Act that requires people in Alabama to use amped up identification to vote. And under Section 5 of the Voting Rights, they have to either submit it to DOJ or take it to a panel of judges in DC to get it cleared before they can put it into effect. And it's getting to the point where I'm sort of hinting, hey, Luther, when are you going to submit this? And they never do. And I finally realized it's because they're waiting on Shelby County versus Holder, the case in front of the United States Supreme Court challenging that pre-clearance process under Section 5. And they believe that they're going to win and that they can put their horrible voter suppression law into effect without anybody ever signing off on it. And of course, that's what happened. They were prepared. The day that Shelby County came down, other states were lining up to bring their own ID acts online. It was a well-oiled machine. I think we have to be prepared for the unexpected here, to see states begin to do what they can to suppress the vote. If the courts, as I believe they will, because Mark is who's litigating these cases and doing it extraordinarily well, if courts refuse to let the president, who has no role in voting, to try to intervene.
Right. And just as let me put my political nerd hat on here. Like, guys, we're already having trouble getting people to show up to vote, even without all of this. We have not surpassed 50% voting in a midterm, except for one time that was 2018, and we got to 50.3%. Right. So there's a broader issue that I'm not gonna bug you guys with. But Mark, one person in the chat just asked a question about the post office and the use of postmarks. Can you just give us a little idea, especially for those folks who vote by mail or permanent absentee, give us a little sense of what the post office has been up to?
Yeah, so there's actually a very important Supreme Court case that actually my law firm and I are involved in out of Mississippi that also touches on this. So one of the things I laid out in March of 2020, actually shortly before the pandemic, were a series of policy choices that states make around mail-in voting that really can be incredibly determinative in how many people vote and whose vote counts and doesn't count. And one of those four things has to do with the speed with which ballots go from being filled out and returned to being counted. And so there's sort of two components to it. The first is how fast the Postal Service moves. And then the second is whether, if the ballot is given to the Postal Service on or before Election Day, does it count if it then arrives after Election Day? So it's kind of like two interrelated questions. One is just like, if you want it to get in by Election Day, how early do you have to mail it? And then the second is, how, if you mail it before Election Day, but it gets in after Election Day, should it count? And the Trump administration, Donald Trump, in his first term, remember, he appointed DeJoy in his first term. And there were complaints about the slowing of the mail service. in Donald Trump's first term. This was something we litigated and were fretted about a lot during the pandemic, along with this other issue about ballots counting if they are put in the mail before election day and received afterwards, because that's a remedy to the increased delays. Well, the Republicans have not given up on either of those two fronts. So as it relates to the mail times, what the Postal Service has done is systematically made the period of time that you need to mail your ballot to be received longer and longer. And there are a number of different rules changes that affected that. But the one that is right now capturing people's attention, but it is only the latest in a series of these things, is a rule that basically says that, number one, post offices will no longer postmark at the recipient post office. They will postmark at a regional center. So if you take your mail-in ballot and you put it in the post box, it will not get postmarked at your local post office, but the next day or the day after that, when it finally gets to a regional center. So you're losing kind of a day on the postmark, even just there. The second thing is, though, that they are removing afternoon mail pickup. That will essentially mean that election mail will just move slower if it's put in the post office in the afternoon. And that is also being done in certain regions and in certain more rural areas rather than urban areas. So those are the two things there. But standing alongside that is an absolute assault that is going to play out in the Supreme Court on March 23rd. Where the Republican National Committee, which, let's be honest, is just a wholly owned subsidiary of Donald Trump,
Literally,
and the Department of Justice, on the RNC side, shocker, also a wholly owned subsidiary of Donald Trump, are taking the position that mail-in ballots that are not received by Election Day need to be thrown in the trash. Now, let me tell you a little bit about some data here. If you were in the state of Florida, a state that's had a long history of mail-in voting and engagement by both parties there. If you were in the state of Florida and you were 18 to 21 and you voted by mail, you had a 5.4% rate of rejection for late received or signature mismatch, which means 1 in every 20 mail-in vote cast by a young person was thrown in the trash. Over age 65, it was 0.6%. So literally, it's the difference between 1 in 20 versus 1 in 200. If you were Black, you had a twice or 3 times rate of rejection as if you were white. So literally, the reason why the RNC is litigating this case and the reason why Donald Trump is so insistent on, slowing down mail and other things is because the people most impacted by these postal issues are young voters and minority voters.
Right.
And so you can see it, like, Reed, you're the expert on politics. Like, whatever people say about, Donald Trump doing better among minority voters or better among young voters in the midterms, like, it's pretty clear what it means if he's able to disenfranchise more people voting by mail in those categories.
Yeah, I mean, think about a place like Ann Arbor, Michigan in the 2022 midterms, where 9 out of every 10 votes in that place, the University of Michigan, obviously, went for a Democratic candidate, right? So yes, I mean, and obviously, Joyce, too, that many other states have made it more difficult for college students in particular to participate if they're away from home, by making them use a local address instead of their parents' address, or getting rid of drop boxes on campus where they can say, okay, we're going to go here. But aside from that, Joyce, I do want to get back to one other thing. And then, guys, we are being demanded for solutions. So we're going to turn to the bright side of things, such as it is. Can you give us a recap on what happened in Dallas last week during the primaries down in Texas?
Yeah, I don't want to be the voice of doom and gloom here. I do want to say that this is precisely the kind of thing that we can expect to see more of, right? I mean, I've said to death tonight that I'm from Alabama. What happened in Dallas reminded me so much of something that we see persistently in Alabama. Black precincts in Montgomery, Alabama, that somehow mysteriously don't get enough ballots in advance of the election, right? Long lines in certain sorts of places. We saw that same sort of monkey business in 2 counties in Texas, including Jasmine Crockett's home county. And I think that sort of raises concerns in an extremely serious way when you see that sort of an effort to make it more difficult for people to go to vote. This goes back to what Mark and what you have said about friction that makes it incrementally more difficult for single parents with kids at home, for older people who can't wait in line. Take your pick for all of the reasons that it becomes difficult to wait longer, to go multiple places, to find out that your polling place has been changed when you're going in to vote. These are all efforts to appear innocuous, but make it more difficult for people to vote. The good news, it's also sort of the bad news, is that typically when we have to go into court, when those sorts of things happen on the day of an election, we're very successful. And the remedy is to hold the polling places out for a longer period of time. I have not seen the numbers. I suspect that Mark has on whether or not voter turnout matched or was significantly less than what was anticipated based on past primaries. That's something that I would certainly want to know. Were these efforts successful in preventing people from turning out to vote? But look, the reality is, and maybe this lets us turn the corner a little bit here, is we just have to be better prepared. We have to vote in massive numbers. That's going to take effort on all of our part to make sure that everybody around us goes out and votes. And there are different stages that are critical. So registering, staying registered, actually voting, and then this one that's increasingly important in light of the mail conversation, making sure that your ballot gets counted. We're going to have to fight for the election at each one of those stages.
And let me put my campaign nerd hat on for a second. If you are an already registered vote by mail voter, permanent absentee, whatever it is, right? When you get that ballot, vote it that day. Don't take any chances. And I've seen a lot of people in the chat also put it in a Dropbox, right? Like, don't take any chances on that. If you know other people who you are worried about this, make sure they do it as well, right? And so, Mark, let's turn to what we can do proactively, as Joyce was talking about. So tell us a little bit about how people can get involved as poll workers, which is always something that counties are dying for, and poll watchers, which is a different thing. And give us an example of what each does.
Sure. So look, we have a crisis in this country of good election officials, like writ large, right? So we have a crisis of, we have always had a crisis of not enough people who want to work elections as poll workers or election officials. It's gotten substantially worse since 2020 because a lot of the good people have just retired or decided they don't want any part of it. And honestly, a lot of bad people, Donald Trump has inspired a lot of bad people to get into it. So, the first thing I always tell people to do if they say, what can I do to help, is if you have the time and you can do it, become a poll worker. Like, it is the high, like on that pyramid of like need, it is the greatest need. Like we have a shortage of people who literally work election day, early voting, after election, in the polls, making sure people are able to vote, ballot counting after election. So if you can do that, volunteer with your local election office. It's usually in most states at the county level, and become a trained, right? You have to become a trained poll worker, highest, best use. If that is not for you and you just, you're not up for all of that commitment, you can become a poll watcher. Now, in some places, those are designated by the campaigns or designated by the political parties. So you can volunteer with your local, you can check in with your local county or state party committee, and they can connect you up with the right thing. There are nonpartisan poll watchers in some places. Some places only allow partisan observers, some allow nonpartisan observers, and they were talking about inside the polls, right? So there are a number of non-partisan organizations that also do that. In some places, or you may say you don't want to do any of that, almost everywhere there are poll observers outside the polls, right? These are people helping to make sure that people who have challenges or have questions about the rules of voting or wind up not being able to vote, they have someone to turn to. And that is available everywhere, right? And there's always a need for that. again, on the partisan side and the nonpartisan side to do that work. So, those are really good ways to get involved. I will add, if working in person on these things is not for you, there are various hotlines. Again, partisan and nonpartisan hotlines that answer questions that that voters have that you can do from home. Requires some training, but again, you can do that from home. And everybody, no matter who you are, if you are on this Zoom, you can become part of a movement of people who shares good, accurate information online and with your friends and your families, at your dinner table, in your bridge club, your book club, your knitting club, with your Facebook groups. And that is something everybody can do and everybody needs to do.
100%. And there are, and let me just say this as someone who spends all day, every day working with grassroots organizations. There are so many groups out there that are overperforming. They are understaffed. They are underfunded, but they are the men and women who pick up a shovel every day and dig in the dirt for democracy. So there are people out there. You can, I'm sure BigTent can provide a list of resources. Joyce, let me ask about this. Are there groups of attorneys in different states that are being prepared? I remember on the presidential campaigns I was on a million years ago, there were always parachute teams of attorneys ready to go. In one particular case that we're all aware of, they actually went somewhere. Are those groups out there? Are they ready to deploy? And if we have attorneys on the call, are there ways they can get involved?
Well, I think that's Marc. Marc is now the
Okay.
head of Parachute Team 101.
Okay.
If you want to volunteer, Marc is a great place to start. It takes a lot of support, seriously. It takes support both financial and from legal talent to keep up the volume of litigation that he does across the board. And the problem day of election is you never really know where problems will crop up. Typically, in most states, both of the political parties separately will run, I don't know what they're called every place else. In Alabama, it's called the boiler room, where you've got lawyers who are fielding phone calls, who are solving problems where they can. 1 year, Marc, I don't know if I've ever told you this story. We had a precinct in Northeast Alabama where it, by the way, was adjacent to one of the historically Black colleges and universities in that area. And we were told that the ballots were soaking wet and they couldn't be run through the machines. And so I gave probably the best legal advice that I've ever given, advising the Secretary of State that they could go out and buy hair dryers and dry the ballots and run them, or otherwise we would have to go to court over that to make sure that those ballots got counted. But I mean, there are super talented state and local people who have years of experience doing this, who do this in many places. But then we're fortunate that we have folks in many of the civil rights groups. The Legal Defense Fund does this, the Lawyers Committee does this, who have the 1-800 numbers for people with questions or problems. But in reality, we rely on the high-end talented lawyers who understand how to litigate much more election outcomes. But also, I think this day of election stuff is going to increasingly be important in the midterms, and that will sort of tell us what we're looking at for 2028.
So, Marc, I saw one question referring to primary elections. Now, we've already had a few last week in Texas and North Carolina, and I don't remember, where the other one was. But are there things that we should be doing to practice these sorts of things in primary elections?
Absolutely. Look, as often as not, the problems that we have in elections are poor design or bad planning. And so primaries are a great place to at least solve those, right? You might not be able to solve the Department of Justice seizing ballots. You may not be able to solve the, right, the federal paramilitary, doing away with parking, but you can deal with the fact that there's not parking because the polling location is sited near a construction zone. You can oftentimes deal with, for example, one of the candidates' names is misspelled, right? There's a lot of stuff that comes up in primary elections that is a really good dry run of where the choke points are going to be. If a state has a new law, for example, about how about about voter ID, for example, you will oftentimes in the primary have the opportunity to see voters showing up without the ID and figuring out the workflow that will become important for the general election, right? Like, what is the best way to deal with that? If you have a state that, for example, just added same-day registration, I wish there were more states doing that. You will have the questions of like what line someone who is same-day registering should be in relative to the people who are already registered. So absolutely, we should treat every election like it is the most important general election, and that includes primary elections, because you tend to work through the process problems, and also you do come across suppressive activity. What the Republicans did in Dallas was suppressive activity. Like they engaged in intentional activity to cause havoc in the Democratic primary and cause there to be voters disenfranchised. So, like you do get that activity as well. And so, yes, we definitely should be paying attention to the primaries.
All right. So, Joyce, based on your experience, what should we be telling our friends and our family and other people we know that are politically interested, maybe not politically active, about what they can and should do in this regard in 2026? Because I'll tell you, if you say, we're trying to save democracy, listen, as someone who talks about democracy all day, every day, sometimes that wasn't enough. But give us a sense of what you would be telling people about why it's important to, the very act of voting matters. And I know that seems overly simplistic, but I feel like sometimes we miss it.
Well, look, I think a powerful argument is to tell people they wouldn't be trying so hard to keep you from voting if your vote didn't matter, right? No one works this hard to take something away from you unless it's very valuable and very powerful. And so this example from Texas, where we saw something, and Mark, I'm sure that this was probably on your radar screen, the idea that Republicans would just say, oh, we're not going to hold these, sort of joint policy or primaries with you that we've historically done. So you got to go vote someplace else, and create all of that confusion. That felt a little bit new to me, and I think we have to anticipate the unexpected. So we need, again, and I guess it's the example of Selma being so recent, but I've been thinking about the powerful lessons of the civil rights movement, one of which is to always work in community, right? To stay in community. And I think ahead of these elections, that's what we need to do. We need to create powerful groups of people that are able to share the most important information as it breaks late, like it did in Texas last week, because I think that's what we're looking at. You can prepare in advance. You need to know who the candidates are. And that's something I think we all need to take upon ourselves as a very serious part of this. Yes, you get to vote. You need to vote responsibly. You need to vote based on access to good, hard information. But we also need to be prepared in advance. If you live in a state where you can vote early, God bless you. I get Tuesday to vote, and that's it. We have 50 different state elections going on. Everybody needs to know what the rules are where they live. If you're in Texas, you can't use your student ID to vote, but you can use your gun permit. These are the sorts of things that we all
Probably
need.
almost as many people have the same thing.
Well, that's true. I mean, I guess it might be really helpful. A lot of good Democrats in Alabama have gun permits. We unfortunately can't use those here. But all joking aside, we need to take this like it's one of the most serious matters that we're looking forward to. And if you're surrounded by people who maybe see some of the need but aren't really involved in the idea that they have to actively participate in voting, well, for heaven's sakes, take them by the hand and bring them in. If you've got to feed people pancakes to get them involved, do that. Just figure out what it's going to take for the people around you to get them involved in voting. And maybe the last thing that I'll say in that regard, Reed, is I'm really worried by the practices that we're seeing that are designed to tamp down on exciting communities about voting. Right in the Deep South, this is souls to the polls, where people would go to church on Sunday and that was used to register people, but also for people to march to the polls and vote. Well, cutting back on early voting days, exempting Sundays, that's a big part of making it more difficult for us to get together in community to encourage the people around us to vote. And that might mean that you've got to start today. talking with your grandkids about why it's so important for them to vote, or just infusing the enthusiasm that you feel and your understanding about how important these primaries are going to be to all of the folks around you.
Okay, actually, Joyce, you just brought up something that Mark is a great segue. So we're talking about starting today, and I know I'm beating the drum all day, every day about this. I have seen, somebody said to me the other day, and I'm going to speak to political leaders, mostly Democratic leaders that I'm going to talk about here, that say, 2026, we'll be lucky to have it, or 2028, we'll be lucky to have it. And one of two things I hear in response to that: one, don't talk that way, you're going to scare people off. The other one is, you say that, but then you go on like you don't actually mean it. And that's a little bit of a concern to me. Like, if you're really this concerned about it, you should act accordingly. So what would you like to see, some of our leaders who we do believe are on the right side of history and justice and the rule of law and democracy doing right now in their states or their counties to make sure that they can try and push back on this?
Yeah. So first of all, I have for many years disagreed with people who say that if you talk about these things, you suppress your vote. I think that's wrong from like a whole bunch of reasons, both quantitative and qualitatively. I think it is wrong. But just suffice to say, in 2026, when you have Donald Trump, the president of the United States, speaking about it in the State of the Union, when you have him saying he will hold up all further legislation, pending voter suppression legislation, like, it's not an option for our side not to talk about it, because
Right.
the other side is talking about it. It's not like if we don't talk about it, no one will hear about it. They'll just only hear one side. So on that, I think what I tell Democrats and elected officials and community leaders and influencers is, you got to talk about it, because the other side is, and we've got to get our message out as well. In terms of what I'd like to say, look, I wrote for Democracy Docket a list of things that every blue state governor and legislature could pass today. Okay, like, we spend an awful lot of time lamenting what is happening in Texas and Alabama and Louisiana and Florida. And believe me, I lament that and I sue them. Okay. But we don't spend a lot of time saying, how could New York make their voting laws better? How could California? How could Oregon? How could Washington? How could, Colorado? How could Illinois? Like, how could New Jersey and now Virginia? Like, what are the things that Democratic controlled states could do today to both make it easier for their people, for their populations to vote, and also to harden their systems against election intimidation, voter suppression, and subversion by right-wing groups? And so It's like, I sometimes get to this part of the conversation and like people go silent because they don't want to be critical of Democrats. And believe me, I'm a big fan of Democrats, but it doesn't mean that in these states where Democrats control the process, there isn't more they can do. I would love to see, Reed, that every Democratic governor and every Democratic legislature commit itself to pass a new voting bill every session, make some improvement on the voting. And, I hear this all the time and I see it in the chat, Colorado's great and Oregon's great and Washington State's great. They reject tens of thousands of ballots in those states. Okay. Does anyone believe there were tens of thousands of fraudulent mail-in ballots in any of those states? No. So they can make those systems better. I'm not saying get rid of mail-in voting. I'm just saying, like, always be looking. Democrats should always be looking for the marginal improvement they can make, rather than just saying we're better than Alabama. Like, with all due respect to Joyce, it's not really much to say we have better voting than Alabama. You should have the best voting possible for your citizens. So that's something that I would encourage every state to do.
And how do you think, practically speaking, that these elected officials, be it the governors, the secretaries of state, the legislatures, could, in your words, harden election systems?
Yeah. So first of all, I think that every state should pass a law, and obviously the Republican states are not going to listen to me, but every state should pass a law that says that it is a state crime to intimidate a voter or an election official. Now, you may say, isn't that already on the books? And the answer is, in most states, no. Like, there may be generalized statutes, but like, there ought to be a targeted, specific law that protects election officials, election workers, and voters, with that is constitutional, doesn't infringe on free speech, but that does that. Number two, every state should ban the practice of third-party voter challenges. Read, no one should be able to look your name up in the voter file and then submit to your county a challenge to your right to vote. Okay, there's that should not be allowed in any state, and it's allowed in most states right now.
But I'm sorry to interrupt. How is that not an equal protection violation?
It is. What winds up happening, Reed.
Sorry, I'm playing jailhouse lawyer.
No. What winds up happening is lawyers like me then wind up having to bring lawsuits against the people filing the challenges to say these are not good faith challenges and they're erroneous. But like in the meantime, you got the voter caught in the middle of this.
Right.
And so blue states could just take this off the table and say, there is no such thing as a third party challenge in our state. No one gets to challenge someone else's right to vote. Finally, I'll give you one more that doesn't involve necessarily hardening, but I'm a big believer in. Every state should pass a law that guarantees voters that they'll wait in line no more than 30 minutes to vote. And if they do, the county cuts you a check, Vance, for your time. Okay. If they wasted an hour and a half of your time, they should pay for an hour and a half of your time. If they wasted 4 hours of your husband's time, they should pay for that. And it should come with an apology note from the county executive that says they apologize for what they did. And look, I'm not saying that lines don't happen, but let's center our voting laws around voters, because the truth is we have an epidemic of long lines in this community, in communities where you have minority voters and young voters, right? And we don't have an epidemic of long lines in Bridgeport, Connecticut, or Westport, Connecticut, but we do in we don't have an epidemic in Westport, Connecticut. We do, however, though, in Bridgeport, Connecticut, right? Yeah. You see this, that in precincts in Fulton County and the 6 counties in Atlanta, in majority Black precincts, you see lines, and in majority white precincts, you don't see lines. So we ought to be tackling those in blue states. And I'm using on purpose states like Connecticut and Virginia and New York as examples, because they should be able to solve this problem. And one way is to guarantee voters no more than 30 minutes in line to vote.
Well, look, if you have to get paid back by the airline for being stuck on the tarmac, I think that
exactly
makes perfect sense. All right, Joyce. First of all, Mark, somebody said something. This is a good news, bad news thing for you. Somebody said in the chat you have job security. So while
I could use something else.
I'm going to say I'm glad. I'm sorry that you have the job security, but I'm also glad you're here to do it. All right.
Reed will tell you, back in the day, my law firm still reasonably good campaign finance lawyers. I'd be just fine not having this job security and going back to that.
Right. Well, you got plenty of, let me just give them a shout out. They are excellent. I know many of them. All right, Joyce, help bring us home here. Give us a little hope. Give us some things that people can do. Give us a little bit of your vision, sitting where you are there in the great state of Alabama, and how you're seeing the country now, and give us something to, I think, you might have said before we started, it's just good to be here. This is better than therapy. What can we take home tonight that feels like we just got out of the doctor's office, we just left the gym, we just got off the yoga mat, whatever somebody's outlet might be?
I mean, let me steal your political hat for a minute, Reed, and just say that in the great state of Alabama, Doug Jones is running for governor.
Amen.
Now, look,
Amen.
In this most recent reporting period, Tommy Tuberville, America's stupidest senator, outraised Doug Tuberville, who doesn't even live in Alabama, Florida resident, Florida man, outraised Doug Jones. However, people ask me frequently, does Doug have a shot? And the answer, to my shock, is yeah, he really does. The energy around campaigns in places where you would not expect Democrats to be running is extraordinary this cycle. I have a lot of friends in red states. I don't remember ever hearing a cycle where people were this enthusiastic. And so, yes, it's critically important. I agree with Mark, for people to get out and work the polls and volunteer to do that. It's also important to run on these campaigns and to do whatever you can, whether that's funding the campaigns, working on the campaigns, or just talking with your friends and neighbors. Increasingly, these conversations are accessible. And I know that political consultants who are much smarter than I am about how this works.
They're not. Well,
but I mean,
as someone who's done it a lot.
And they say that candidates should talk about kitchen table issues. And of course they can. But what I learned writing my book and going around the country and talking with people in the middle of those off-year elections is that Americans are unbelievably smart and nuanced and complex. And people who don't have legal backgrounds, or maybe don't have the political background, they can still understand that there are kitchen table issues and that there are democracy issues. And that if you want to have any chance of dealing with whatever the issues are that matter to you the most, whether it's climate change, whether it's affordability, that you have to find a way to hold on to the democracy. Because if you have a king who's just serving his own purposes, calling the shots, then you have no hope of having a better life for you, your family, your future. I think we need to unashamedly be making that case to the American people, not just relying on Democratic candidates to make that case. I think that's a case that each of us needs to take on responsibility for making to the people around us. Because look, your friends and your neighbors, they don't really care what talking heads like me on television have to say. What they care about is what you say to them when you're sitting with them having coffee, when you're waiting in the checkout line at the grocery store. You are their trusted source of information. And so I think we need to take that message to people and say, I get so sick of hearing the politicians say that the next election is the most important one of your lives, but by God, it's true this time. And if we don't pull this off at the midterms and set up some guardrails, then we have nothing but kleptocracy and kakistocracy to look forward to, right? Corruption and incompetence. And we need much better than that.
We have plenty of that. And I can just say, let me give a plug for Doug Jones too, former U.S. attorney, former civil rights attorney, won a U.S. Senate race that he was not supposed to win, that no one told him he could win. And yes, it is a sad state, I must say, Joyce, that the dumbest member of the U.S. Senate, Jeff Sessions, was replaced by the next dumbest member of the U.S. Senate in Tommy Tuberville. All right.
Now, Reed, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
When you do these and you've got someone from Oklahoma on, do you really still say it's Tuberville, or is there a certain senator getting an elevation from that
okay,
state?
So you know what, Mark, I must say this, and Melissa, I could see you waiting in the wings, so you just indulge me for a second. What everyone should know about Mark Wayne Mullen is that before he ran for the United States Senate, his name was Mark Wayne Mullen, and he chose to push his first and middle names together. I think that tells you everything you need to know about that man. All right, Mark, tell us how more of us can do what you do, which is you wear a smile, but you carry a hammer in one hand and a shield in the other. Tell us how we could be more like you.
Look, I think that what we lack right now in this country is civic engagement and moral courage. And, that's really all I'm trying to do. Like, I have certain tools available to me, and I wake up every day saying I'm going to use those tools to try to protect democracy from Donald Trump and ensure free and fair elections. And if that means I can speak out to groups like this, then I'm going to speak out to groups like this. If it means I can post on social media, I'm going to do that. If it means I can go to the Supreme Court, as I did earlier this term, and argue a case in the Supreme Court, I'm going to do that. But there is no task that is too big for me, and there's no task that's too small. Like I don't do the I don't do that because someone else should do that. And I also don't say, well, someone else will solve this. I just do everything I can, and because that's in civic engagement. And then the second part, and this is Reed, something that you're more courageous than anyone than me, is just being willing to stand up and say, you know what, Donald Trump can come after me. He can call me an election stealing lawyer. He can call me a communist. He could say I'm destroying America. He can issue a presidential memorandum targeting me by name. Just as we've been on here, my team is telling me that, Harvey Dillon, the head of the Civil Rights Division, is attacking me.
I remember her from California. She was a goon there too.
She put out some video attacking me over whatever nonsense. But I'm just not going to I'm not going to back down. I'm not going to be afraid. I'm not going to bend a knee. Donald Trump sued me for racketeering in Florida, and I didn't settle. I fought and I won. And we just need to all have the willingness to just say, you know what, I'm going to do the thing that I need to do, that I can do in this time of crisis. Because I'll end with this. A lot of people on this call have children or grandchildren. And I can promise you that years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, not a single one of them is going to come to you and ask you, what did you do to lower gas prices? Not a single one is going to come to you and say, what did you do?
Right.
Because the stock market was down. They're going to come to you and ask in 2026, when democracy was at stake and everything was on the line, what did you do? And you may be inclined to tell them how you felt. And they're going to say, no, mom, no, grandma. I don't care how you felt. I want to know what you did. and you're going to want to be able to tell them what you did. And so there's something that each and every one of us can do. And that's the thing you need to do today.
Well, amen. And I would say this, guys, first and foremost, Joyce and Mark, thank you so much for doing this. As always, sharing your big, enormous brains and your absolute commitment with us. And to everybody else who joined us tonight, this has been just terrific. I could not have been happier to be here.
And thank you, Reed.
Oh, no, thank you,
I
Melissa.
thank the three of you for the what is it? The civic engagement and moral courage. That's the headline for all of us. Thank you for pointing it out. So thanks for helping us, unload and make sense of what we have to do, and for all the great ideas. And we love having you with us. And we just hope that you'll come back again before the election. All of you.
Of course.
I go wherever Reed and Joyce tell me to go.
Okay,
Right.
good.
Absolutely. And we both listen to Joyce. So
we do.
I'm liking how this is shaping up. This is good.
We all do.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone who joined us in the Big Tent this evening. Follow us on social media and on Substack. And please come back again soon. And good night, everybody. Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks, y'all.